In this tutorial, we're recreating this epic title sequence from Fallout TV show with the burning paper effect that reveals the logo underneath. You'll learn how to create a realistic burn transition in Blender, complete with glowing embers that only appears where the paper is actually burning, just like in the show. I'm using Blender 4.4 for this, so let's jump straight in. We can start by opening a new scene and deleting the default cube and the light. Then we can reset the camera by pressing Alt-R and Alt-G, and we can rotate it by 90 degrees on the X-axis and move it back a little bit. We'll fine-tune the framing once we bring the Fallout logo, which you can easily find by searching for Fallout logo SVG on Google. To add the logo, we can go to File, Import, and select Scalable Vector Graphics. When you import the SVG to Blender, it's usually very small, so we need to scale it by a lot. We can also rotate it and place it in the middle of the scene and apply the scale. Ideally, we would manually build the topology, but for this we can use Remesh modifier, and for that to work we need to add a little bit of thickness to the logo. As these are still curves, we can use extrude under geometry in the curve properties. We only need a small amount for the Remesh modifier to work properly. Now we can add the Remesh modifier. For the method, choose Sharp and uncheck Remove Disconnected, and for the octree we can put 10. We can turn this into Real Mesh now by going right click and Visual Geometry to Mesh. We can also apply all transforms as we rotated the logo. Now this geometry won't be perfect, so we need to fix some parts like these sharp corners here. After we fix the geometry, we can set up the camera framing, and also it's a good time to animate the subtle pushing effect that we can see in the original title. Original title is around 7 seconds long, so we can adjust the end frame to 160. Select the camera, and on the frame 1 we can add a keyframe on the focal length of the camera. And on the last frame we can zoom in a little bit and add another keyframe. Now we have this subtle pushing effect. Okay, now it's time to make the mask for the burning effect. There are many ways of doing this, but all of them are based on the same principle, where you will create a mask that is used as an alpha to reveal or delete part of the mesh. This can be done both in shader nodes or geometry nodes. Reason why I'm doing this in geometry nodes is because we can use the same mask to spawn the embers on the edges where the burning is happening. We can select the logo and create a new geometry node tree. What we need to do is to capture the mask as an attribute that we can later use in the shader nodes. So the first node that we're going to add is the store name attribute nodes, and we can name this edge or whatever you want. So whatever we connect to this is going to be our final mask that we're going to use in the shader nodes. I'm going to add edge angle node. And we can preview this by connecting it to the viewer node. And as you can see, we're getting this mask around the edges. And for this node to work, your logo will need to have a little bit of thickness. To expand this mask, we can add blur attribute node. And we can increase the iterations to 21. And as you can see, now we have the larger area here around the corners. Our mask will mainly be influenced by the noise texture, but the reason we are creating this edge mask is to ensure that some of the burning is finishing on the edges and it's not completely random. We can add the noise texture now. We can preview it by holding Ctrl Shift and clicking on the node. I'm gonna uncheck normalize to get the full values of the noise. And this is what will be the main pattern for the burning edge. So by adjusting these parameters, you will create a pattern that you need for the effect. What you want to look at is the white parts, as we are going to invert the mask later when we combine it with the edge part. Now we can add the matte node set to add to combine these two nodes, and as you can see, this added the white parts of the edge mask. Like I said, we're going to invert this mask, and there are a couple of different ways of doing this, but I will use multiply add node, as with this I can invert the mask and control the spread. I'm gonna set multiply to -10 to invert the mask, and with the addend I can control the spread of the mask, and this is what we can use to animate the mask. Here you can see the difference with or without the edge mask. Now if you want all of the edges to be burnt and finishing on the edges, you can use color mix node set to linear light instead of add node. With the factor you can control how much the noise is breaking up the edges, and this will give you a little bit of different effect, but in this case I will stay with the add node. Though I will use the color mix node to combine two different noises to get a little bit more detail on the edges, but more importantly I want to add some movement. We can duplicate the noise texture and combine them together with the color mix node, and we are going to connect this to the add node. I'm going to lower the factor to a very small number, as I want this second noise to have very small influence. We can adjust this noise by increasing the scale, a little bit of detail and roughness also. If needed, we can still decrease the factor. Now, I'm gonna change this noise from 3D to 4D, and we can add a driver into the W here by typing hashtag frame divided by 1000. We need to divide this by a big number as we uncheck normalize. This will add a little bit of movement to the noise, which will help with selling the effect. Next thing we can make is the particle system that will spawn on the areas where the burning is happening. First, we can add distribute point on faces node, and we can connect this separately from the main geometry. We can lower the density to 3 for now. We're going to join these two branches with join geometry node, so we have the main geometry of the logo on the output and the particles as well. And now we have these particles that are appearing on the faces of the main logo, but we don't want them to appear everywhere, but just on the edges that are burning. So we need to create the mask for that. And I forgot to connect this to the store attribute node. We can move these back to make more space as well. To create the mask, we're gonna connect this multiply add node through the color ramp node. We need to move the white flag to the middle, and we can add another flag and move it to the right corner and make this black. And if you preview this mask now, we can see that the only white parts are where the burning is happening. So we can connect this to the selection socket of the distribute point node. So to have particles continue spawning, we need to add simulation zone. We can connect distribute point node to the input and the output to the join geometry node. We can disconnect this. We can copy this join geometry node and place it into the simulation zone, and we can connect the distribute point node here from the outside of the simulation zone. And we need to add the scene time node and connect that to the seed socket of the distribute point node. So now we have particles appearing randomly on each frame, but only on the areas where the burning edge is. As you can see, they are staying still, so we need to make them move. We can add the set position node into the simulation zone after the join geometry. In the offset socket, we can connect the vector math node set to add, and we can add a small amount under the Z vector. I use 0.01. And if we press play now, we can see that the particles are moving up each frame. Now we just need to add a little bit of noise to the movement. I used curl noise turbulence node from Bradley's animation free preset. I will leave the link in the description. I had the frequency set to 1 and scale to 0.05. And if we press play now, we can see that this looks more like flying embers. If you don't want to use the preset, you can use a regular noise node and connect the color socket to the subtract node and subtract 0.5, so it moves in every direction. And you can use scale node to control the strength of the noise. This will give you a similar result, but I liked how the turbulence noise looks better, so I will go with that. We also need to record the age of the particles, so we can use that for the materials of the ember, as eventually they extinguish. We can add the store name attribute node and name this age. We will connect the math node set to add, and in the first socket we can connect the age attribute, and the second socket we can set to 1. So each frame this will add 1 to the age attribute. Additionally, we also need to set the size of the points. So outside of the simulation zone, we can add the set point radius node. And we can use the random value node with the small numbers, so we have random size of the particles. And lastly, we need to set the material node that will be set only to the embers. We can add the set material node after the point radius. Also, we need to create the material before we can assign it. And now we can finally build the materials. But before we do that, we can set the lighting so we can actually preview the materials better. We can go to render mode, and I'm using Eevee for now, but all of this will work in cycles as well. In Eevee, we can turn on ray tracing, and also we can turn on motion blur, as the embers will look better. In the world tab, we can turn the color to black, and now we can start adding the lights. I will first add the spotlight, and we need to rotate it by 90 degrees on the x-axis. And we need to move it back. Under the light properties, you can adjust the settings to your liking. Here you can see the values that I used. When you're happy how the light looks, we can go to the last frame and add the keyframe to the power, and we can go to the first frame and lower the power until everything is dark and add another keyframe. I also want to add a smoke to the scene, so we can add a cube and scale it to cover the whole logo and the area visible by the camera. Don't forget to apply the scale. In the shader nodes, we can add a new material, and we can delete the principal BSDF and add the volume scatter node, and we can preview this in the render mode. You can try these different options, but I went with Rayleigh. For the density, we can add the noise texture and color ramp node to control the contrast. and you can adjust the noise as per your liking. I also changed the noise to 4D to add some movements to the smoke. In the EV settings, you will need to check volumetric shadows, which I forgot. In color ramp, we can decrease the value of the white color to decrease the thickness of the smoke. To make this look a little bit better, I also added 2 point lights, one on the left that I gave a little bit of orange color, and one on the right that was a little bit cooler. And for both of these, I animated the strength so it starts completely dark and slowly comes to light. Now finally we can make the materials. First, we will start with the embers as it's easier. We can add the attribute node and use age attribute. We will connect this through the color ramp and we can set up the colors to how we want the embers to look as the age, from left to right. When they are born, we can set bright yellow color, and in the middle we can place red, and on the end, as they reach certain age, they turn to black. And we can connect this to the color of the emission. For the emission strength, we can use 0.5. We still don't see any change, as we didn't specify the value at which we want this ramp to happen. So we need to add the math node set to divide, and here we can write the number at which we want the particles to turn to black, and this will be their lifespan. And that's it for the embers material. Now we can work on the logo material. Here we also need to add the attribute node and use edge attribute, which we will connect to the alpha socket. And now we can see the mask that we created in geometry nodes, which I actually forgot to animate, so we will need to go back to geometry nodes. But first we can finish setting up this material. We can connect this mask through the color ramp node, and here we can set up the colors that will go to emission, which will be those burning edges. Similar to the embers, color will need to go from left to right. So we can place the bright red on the left side and bright yellow in between the red and the black, which will also need to be moved to the left towards the middle. And if we connect this to the color of the emission and increase the emission strength, we can see these colors on the edges. Now we can add a little bit of grunge to the text by using noise texture and color ramp to control the contrast, and we will connect this to the color of the BSDF node. We can also use this as a height information and connect this to the bump node that will go to the normal socket. Now, of course, this is too strong, so we can decrease the distance, and you can play with the strength as well. To add a bit more interest to this, we can add the color mix node set to multiply and factor to 1, and we can connect attribute node with the color ramp to the bottom of the socket. Playing with these colors, we can get some interesting effects on the outside of the burning edges. We can also adjust the strength of the emission so it's not uniform by adding noise texture, and we can uncheck normalize and increase the scale. I will add 2 more math nodes here, add to control the contrast and multiply to control the strength. This is only to break up the strength of the emission so it's not the same everywhere. And we can animate the multiply node set to 0 on the frame 1, and it goes up to 1 after a few frames as the lights are getting brighter. You can experiment with these values. And for the end, we need to go back to the geometry nodes to animate the burning edges using multiply add node. We can go to frame 1 and set the addend to 0 and add a keyframe. And we can go to last frame and set the value until all the burning is gone and set another keyframe. And now we have animated burning edge effect and embers spawning on the edges as well. You can experiment with these values to get the effect that you want. This will all work in cycles. You will just need to adjust the light values as they are not working the same as in Eevee. I hope you learned something new and see you in the next video.